Colin Campbell is our correspondent joining us from Washington, D.C. Also, Joseph Richardson is a professor of African American Studies and Anthropology at the University of Maryland, who joins us from Laurel, Maryland. Welcome to you both. Colin, tell us more about what has occurred during this weekend. And it sounds pretty bad, but it seems like this particular holiday actually is marred with violence in the past. And maybe you can give us a briefing on that also.
Yeah, Memorial Day weekend, a time when people usually look to the opening of the summer, when people get out. School has ended for a lot of different universities and colleges, and is just a couple weeks away for ending for younger students as well. People go out and barbecue, they spend time with family, they remember the fallen in our military. Well, there's also a troubling past as well when we look at some of the violence that has happened during Memorial Day weekend. And this weekend, this past weekend was no different, leaving 16 people dead across several U.S. states. And these shootings happened at barbecues, like I just talked about, at beaches, at parades, at bars and restaurants. It really was very mixed in the way and places where these shootings happened. And they were happening sometimes in crowds, sometimes they happened in isolated incidents, like in Baltimore, not too far from Laurel, Maryland, not too far from Washington, D.C., quite frankly, only about an hour away, where two men were arguing, and that dispute ended in gunfire. And what we're seeing and what we saw over Memorial Day weekend was just a spate of numerous shootings that could have been prevented had the proper preventions been put into place. But we're seeing across the nation a divestment in communities. We're seeing a loosening of gun laws like we're seeing in Florida. And we're seeing just a lower tolerance for trying to de-escalate issues instead of just using a gun to settle disputes. Even in Washington, D.C., in North Carolina recently, there was a shooting on a bus. There was a bus driver who was confronted by a passenger who didn't like the place where the bus driver was going to drop him off, and he instantly just started opening fire on the bus driver. The bus driver happened to have a gun on him, started to fire at the passenger. And you had two other passengers who were just trying to scramble away with their lives during just a regular bus ride. No one was killed in that exchange, but it just goes to speak to just the randomness and sometimes the callousness or just the lack of inhibition when it comes to using a firearm on another individual. And this is happening across the U.S. This weekend was indicative of that, but it's going to keep happening across the country as well. As far as I'll speak very briefly about Memorial Day, a lot of people don't know that actually started out within the Black community, within what I call Black society, because we're made up of many communities, but Memorial Day was a way to remember those people who had passed away. And the Black community was the one that actually initiated Memorial Day, and that idea was taken up by the greater society and then made into a national holiday.
Well, Professor Richardson, when we take a look just at this particular holiday, just a quick question comes about based on the past and how it's marred by violence, and this particular one was no different in a sense, except for the numbers either being up or either more or less in terms of the number of shootings or what have you. Why can't this be controlled if law enforcement knows in advance that you're going to have a holiday that is going to involve shootings and what have you?
I think based on what was previously said, you have a number of people who are gathering together. Many who don't know each other are coming into similar social spaces. An argument starts. People don't have the proper de-escalation and conflict resolution skills. And you have a number of people who are armed in these situations, as was mentioned. And we clearly have far more guns in this country than we do citizens. And when you culminate that with a weekend where people are also drinking, coming into spaces where they are meeting people who they may or may not know, it's almost impossible for the police to provide any sort of enforcement in terms of social gatherings where the police can't be there at every single turn of events. nor can they be there to police incidents where you have two individuals who may possibly be intoxicated, have a firearm, or getting into a conflict where they can de-escalate that. And so, yes, it may be possible to provide law enforcement in public spaces where we know there will be a number of people gathering, but many of the situations that we're seeing are often social activities where they may be in private events at someone's home, maybe in someone's neighborhood, where there's almost impossible to provide that level of police coverage in all of those situations. And even we have seen, for example, in Philadelphia, on South Street, which is a widely attended street in Philadelphia, frequented by tourists and Philadelphia residents alike, that even when there are police there in some situations, that cannot prevent a mass shooting from happening. And so we've seen that in Philadelphia and other situations and events across this nation, even when police are present, that they may not possibly diffuse or deter a mass shooting.
How would you assess, Colin, the way that U.S. President Joe Biden has dealt with mass shootings, with shootings in general, in terms of, I don't know, from background checks to the efforts that he has put forward, or the lack of it, however way you view it, based on the fact that just so many have taken place, and we've heard him come out on so many occasions?
I would say it's mixed, and more on the side of he's not doing enough. I don't want to say that he hasn't done anything, that he's been silent about it, because we've had politicians who have been also silent, probably evaluating them on the worst end of the scale. But when it comes to President Biden, he has talked about it. Again, I don't think that he's forceful enough with his Democratic allies to really push legislation. At the same time, not that I'm a President Biden defender, but he is working and has to work with Congress. And we do have one part of Congress that is his political rivals, who are Republicans, who are very reluctant to really put forth any legislation. In fact, there have been many Republican lawmakers who have actually loosened gun laws, like I talked about in Florida with the governor, Ron DeSantis. Although he's not in Congress, you do have congressional members who are in lockstep with the governor, who agree with the governor in loosening gun laws. And we see that happening in various states where they have allowed people to open carry. I believe in Florida, they want to loosen the law where you don't even really need to have a permit. You can just buy a gun, meaning you can easily buy a gun almost as easily as you could buy bread in that state in the future. There might be a license or something like that that you might have to get, or some kind of training. But even that is largely left out of the conversation of gun access. It's really, once you become a certain age, you are actually protected under the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, which is what a lot of gun advocates usually cite, to go out to the store and buy a gun. And let me tell you, if you are living in a food desert where there isn't a place where you can buy food easily, it might be actually easier to buy a gun than it is actually to buy food to nourish your body. I mean, I know that sounds crazy, but we're starting to get to a point where in some states that could become the reality. And when it comes to the president, he could be pushing and speaking a lot more vocally about the gun violence. Right now, for example, we're talking about the debt ceiling. That is what is at the level of salience, not the more than a dozen bodies that were left over the weekend as a result of gun violence.
All right, a final question, quickly if you can, because we don't have much time, Professor Richardson. Based on the availability of guns, I'm sure that in certain areas in the U.S. where they're called projects, you could practically walk in there and just ask around and buy a gun, just as easily as our correspondent there mentioned. Why isn't that being controlled in terms of at least trying to reduce the number of guns that way, where it's not that easy to purchase it? Isn't that one starting point that could maybe eliminate, even if it's one death, that it's doing the job?
I mean, clearly, I think we have a problem with the number of guns that are flooding the streets of this country. But I also would say we need to really crack down in terms of the production of guns and how we treat gun manufacturers. And so there's also the element of capitalism in this equation, which we can't overlook. I mean, guns make money for a number of gun manufacturers across this country. There have been civil suits that have been more civil suits that have been recently filed against gun manufacturers. But unless we begin to stop the stem of guns that are coming in our community, which are directly coming from gun companies, which seem to be doing quite well, particularly during COVID when we had a spike in the number of Americans who were buying guns. That's really at the heart of it, how we find so many guns that are flooding our streets. And so this conversation also needs to incorporate the gun manufacturers, the Smith & Wessons, the Glocks, the Berettas. We need to also crack down on how many gun manufacturers are engaged in pushing guns that ultimately end up on our streets in this country, because there's no reason why we have far more guns than Americans. And let me just add, even if we were to reduce through what we've seen in gun trace task force, gun recovery units, whether they reduce 300 or 3,000, and I've said this many times before, it will not stop the number of homicides and non-fatal shootings that we've seen, and that's empirically been proven. What I am fearful of in this conversation is that we don't move into taking a page out of the war on drugs, where the only communities that are being policed and heavily surveilled, and you just mentioned public housing, that those communities are predominantly Black. Because what we will find is that, as we have seen in the past, is that egregious practices in terms of stop and frisk, violating the constitutional rights of many people who are innocent in these cities who are not carrying guns, because the policing won't be based on intelligence policing. And so I often fear that in terms of the Second Amendment, that Second Amendment, as has been in the history of this country, will be cracked down in Black and brown communities, when we know that the typical gun owner in this community doesn't look like the people who live in those communities.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, Professor Joseph Richardson there, Professor of African American Studies and Anthropology at the University of Maryland. And thank you, Colin Campbell, who spoke to us from Washington, D.C. Thank you to you both.
Got it.
With that, we come to an end for this edition of the News Review.